Sukuna versus Muzan. The most powerful Jujutsu sorcerer in history versus the king of all demons. These two characters naturally garner comparisons due to their similar roles and level of power within their respective stories. And the battles between these villains and their protagonists was, and still is, the hardest fight their main cast had to deal with. And in this video, we'll be deciding who's stronger, the King of Curses or the Demon King. As what is essentially the pinnacle of the Demon Slayer universe, Muzan Kibitsuji scales to nearly every feat in the entire Demon Slayer manga. The Hashira, Lower, and Upper Moon demons that he commands all scale far below him individually, and this is important when going over his specific stats. Starting with attack potency, Demon Slayer characters are kinda wonky, or rather unimpressive relative to some of Muzan's other abilities that he has at his disposal. In a weakened state during the final battle of the manga, his tendrils and extra limbs are capable of smashing up buildings very casually and creating craters in the ground that are calculated to be about building level in terms of scope. Muzan himself doesn't really demonstrate very many destructive feats aside from a few that we'll be talking about, as for a majority of the manga, he's a non-combatant and delegates his fighting to his underlings. This delegation, however, allows us to scale him off of his lower level demons, namely Doma, who, with the creation of his Ice Buddha, is calculated to have city block levels of output, which is a pretty healthy upgrade from the building level feats that Muzan puts on display in his fight. We can take his attack potency and general strength one step further when we notice that the impact and shockwaves of Muzan's attacks are able to reach much further than the direct area that he's attacking, and when accounting for the distance covered, intensity of the shockwaves, and speed at which they travel, Muzan's attack potency can be scaled all the way to large town level, which is pretty alright all things considered. As is the case with most characters that use their own body to fight, Muzan's durability should be somewhat comparable to his own attack potency, which is why he can withstand the force of his own attacks. This applies for most of his body, however his neck specifically should be much tougher than any other part of him, as this seems to be where demons generally concentrate most of their durability. By the way, I just want to nip this potential argument in the bud, but just because the Infinity Castle was constructed from the blood demon art of one of his underlings does not in fact mean that the character doing so has infinite attack potency and that Muzan would possess that as well. If we were to use that logic, then Sukuna being able to clash domains with Gojo, someone whose domain possesses and fills the user's brain with an infinite amount of information, would also put him in that tier. Needless to say, it's not only inconsistent with other feats demonstrated in the story, but the ability itself is never implied to be reflective of the demon's overall outputting abilities. Now, while Muzan's power is certainly of note, especially when you go into the higher end arguments for him, I would argue that his speed, and Demon Slayer characters' speed in general, is much more impressive relative to their overall scaling than anything. I say this mainly because even lower tier Hashira that Muzan would absolutely trounce have feats under their belt that's definitely enough to turn heads and at least be somewhat interesting. Kanroji is a great example of this, as before taking on the Hashira training, she was capable of rather consistently dodging, reacting to, and even slashing bolts of lightning, and Muzan is capable of blitzing her and several other characters consistently shown to be much faster than her, even after multiple training arcs and buffs that would consistently amplify her previously shown speed. Even if we're not able to get an exact figure from knowing all of this information, it does just mean that Muzan's speed is his second biggest upside when going into a fight with someone like Sukuna. Now, the consistency of Kanroji's lightning dodging and the lack of contradicting statements or feats makes this quite the reasonable place to scale the character and anybody that scales above her, but I have seen extreme low balls and high balls for where this character and high tiers in general could scale in the speed department, so I'll cover them quickly. People highballing Muzan in particular would argue that he and his upper moons should be sub-relativistic in speed, or simply put, approaching the speed of light in terms of their combat and attack speed due to the sheer difference between them and every other lightning timer level character. While this in itself isn't necessarily absurd, I do think that it is a much greater interpretation of Muzan's speed than what is intended in many instances of the Demon Slayer manga. Conversely, I also find the vaguely faster than sound arguments for Demon Slayer characters silly, and it is mostly predicated on very early Zenitsu scaling and a general skepticism for a verse like Demon Slayer being fast. As always, I'll account for these discrepancies in speed scaling when going over the match and its outcome, but if you're looking for my personal interpretation of Muzan's speed, just know that he's greatly beyond being a lightning timer. This just leaves us to discuss Muzan's hacks and abilities, and if his speed was his second greatest advantage, then his myriad of hacks and techniques are a clear first. In terms of normal resistances, Muzan has plenty. Any attack that isn't reinforced by Nichiren is incapable of killing him. His natural regeneration is absolutely ridiculous and surpasses all of the healing factors shown in the series up to this point. All of his on-screen healing feats are even more impressive when you consider the fact that at this point, he's poisoned and aging at an extremely rapid rate, forcing his healing factor to kick into overdrive. Alongside this, he also has the standard never-ending stamina of a demon, as well as being impervious to death without the aid of the sun. In his combat form, Muzan gains an extra set of limbs and general combat abilities, not too dissimilar from the King of Curses who he'll be going up against. In this combat form, he has whip-like appendages that he could extend from his arms, legs, and spine at high speeds to attack from a distance, and suctions that can draw any opponent within range unwillingly. To the chagrin of the Hashira and fans of Demon Slayer in that final fight, these whips seem to be a primary form of attack for Muzan, and they're quite effective. Muzan is also able to infuse his own blood into his attacks, which makes repeated contact with him and his slashes a continuously deadly occurrence as his blood causes cell death. His blood can also be utilized to create solid spikes, and with his blood demon art, he can even shoot out massive blasts of energy that damage the nervous system of anyone caught within its blast radius. Muzan's abilities and resistances are the main contributors to what makes this such an interesting fight when regarding his clash with Sukuna, and makes this more than a potential one-sided slaughter in any given character's favor. So far, we've analyzed his speed, we've analyzed his power, and now we've analyzed his abilities. Before I can go over the outcome of this fight, however, we must first do the same for Ryomen Sukuna. Much like Muzan, Sukuna exists as a nearly uncontested pillar of individual power within his universe, and as such, scaling his physical abilities is relatively simple. When it comes to his strength and general attack potency, this fact is extremely obvious. Even with only 15 fingers worth of his power, Sukuna at the bare minimum should be able to output city levels of force with his high level attacks, as demonstrated in Shibuya with his domain expansion and fire arrow combination used on Maharaga. Obviously, not being at full power here would necessitate that a full 20-finger Sukuna would be capable of exerting even larger amounts of force at any given moment, but when trying to determine how much more, you need look no further than the domain expansions of disaster class level cursed spirits like Jogo and Dagon to find your answer. Why these two? Well, the answer lies in the creation of their domains and the contents of it. The mountain and island respectively created within these cursed spirits domain is merely a manifestation of their own innate domains brought into reality via cursed energy, and the creation of such large masses of land is in itself indicative of quite the energy output potency, especially when considering that these characters are capable of creating such swaths of land in an instant. Sukuna greatly eclipses both characters in refinement, output, efficiency, and reserves, as Jogo acknowledges that he'd get absolutely demolished if he clashed domains with Sukuna, which states pretty directly that the potency of Sukuna's domain is greater than that of Jogo's and Dagon's as a result of the power rankings amongst disaster cursed spirits. Now, you may doubt the validity of this line of scaling because the external barriers of domains are always so small, but that supposed contradiction is explained within the story itself. The nature of barrier techniques allow for a warping of space in such a way that the internal and external conditions are not congruent with one another, which is why in Gojo and Sukuna's fight, the outside of the domain is smaller than that of a basketball, yet Gojo and Sukuna have no trouble duking it out inside the barrier. The same thing rings true here, and the creation of massive land masses with Jogo and Dagon. This domain scaling indicates that these characters are capable of constructing huge chunks of land with their cursed energy alone, and while this wouldn't normally translate to a JJK character's base durability or stats, in Gojo and Sukuna's case, it more than likely does, or at least have some correlation, as Gojo is capable of tanking Jogo's domain-based attacks with no trouble, yet Sukuna is capable of harming Satoru on multiple occasions in their fight. What substantiates this even more are two calcs that estimate Gojo is around island level, based on him being able to power a country with his cursed energy alone, and an earthquake caused by his unsealing being scaled and properly analyzed. Considering how relative these two characters are in basically every combat capacity, saying that Sukuna scales comparatively to Gojo based on these calcs isn't at all absurd or unreasonable. Substantiating further the mountain to island levels of strength, Sukuna should be capable of wielding that much more. This should also apply to his durability, considering that the same curse energy used to enhance his physical abilities can conversely be used to reinforce his body and make him significantly more sturdy. Sturdy enough to even survive a 200% hollow purple with only the loss of his arms, and a secondary purple towards the tail end of his fight with Gojo while still surviving. In terms of speed, it gets a little bit more complicated as there are many more levels that you can scale Sukuna to and many more interpretations that you can have for the character, with the lowest of low ends placing him vaguely above Mach 3, which is based on the Naoya projection sorcery statement and Maki's ability to outspeed that. Sukuna obviously has shown himself in his gauntlet to be able to go back and forth with Maki, so it's quite clear that he should at the bare minimum scale to whatever Maki was able to. You can greatly raise the ceiling for what Sukuna scaling can be by looking at his blitz of piercing blood. Moving so fast relative to an attack that moves faster than sound would put him anywhere from 25 to 50 times the speed of sound himself. This range is what I would consider most consistent and defendable for Jujutsu Kaisen speed scaling, but you can argue that other characters in the story, namely Akari, has been shown capable of dodging and reacting to lightning, as is demonstrated in his fight against Kashimo, and his implied relativity to other heavy hitters would place Sukuna well beyond that. In a vacuum, this lightning timer scaling doesn't really follow any poor line of reasoning, with it mostly falling apart or at least being placed under a very critical lens due to the angle and nature of Akari's supposed avoidance. Whether Akari was capable of outright dodging that stroke of lightning or Kashimo merely aimed for that place on his body is difficult to determine, and while Akari was able to eject curse energy from his body and perceive a stroke of lightning from Kashimo later in their bout, it's impossible to extrapolate how this correlates necessarily to his physical combat speed. I'll still leave this as a potential high end for Sukuna, but it's not necessarily what I would consider bulletproof in terms of reasoning. Finally, you have light speed Jujutsu Kaisen scaling, which would only apply to Gojo and Sukuna, and in all honesty, this level of interpretation for the verse doesn't have any legs to stand on. Sure, Sukuna is shown avoiding an attack that should be moving at light speed, as Kashimo was shooting off electromagnetic waves, but once again, the ambiguous nature of the feat doesn't allow for a concrete determination of Sukuna's speed. Did he dodge once the attack had already been launched, or was he in the process of avoiding where Kashimo was aiming? Both are very realistic possibilities with no way to prove one way or the other, and as such, I find it to be quite shaky as a point. Could you argue it? Sure, but it's pretty narratively consistent with all of the other characters and their speed shown throughout the manga, so I'll cap Sukuna's speed scaling at being vaguely above a lightning timer, with everything above that just being unfounded or a bit too vague to argue logical consistency for fights within Jujutsu Kaisen thus far. Now, while Sukuna's strength, speed, and durability would already make him one of the strongest characters in his verse, very similarly to Muzan, I think that it's his unique arsenal of moves, and in Sukuna's case specifically, his strategic mindset, that take him from being your average tough fight to the most grueling opponent our protagonists have faced in the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen. Dismantle and Cleave obviously exists as the core of Sukuna's kit, and a moveset that on its own trips up many characters in the story. The sheer cutting power of this technique, combined with their invisible nature, allows for Sukuna to cut down a majority of his universe without worry, and when Cleave's durability adjusting slashes are involved, the lethality of Sukuna's slashing capabilities is only amplified. On top of his normal technique, he also has reverse curse technique, which allows him to heal from insane amounts of damage, ranging from limb loss to the very destruction of his heart. And in Sukuna's case specifically, he's even capable of reviving himself upon death so long as the damage isn't too extreme. And even fighting without a heart for extended periods of time doesn't seem to be much of an issue for him. Even poison should be no trouble for Sukuna to heal from, as he has a top 3 reverse curse technique display in the entire story. Now, whether or not he's straight up immune to toxic or poisonous attacks is a bit ambiguous, as it's implied that Yuji's immunity to poisons is in some way linked to Sukuna, but it's hard to determine whether it's caused by him or not. As the king of toxins, Sukuna could be immune to them himself, or this title could simply be referring to him being the greatest poison in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. In the event Sukuna himself bears no immunity, reverse curse technique is still an option that he has at his disposal. Now, alongside his regenerative ability and slashing techniques, His maneuverability is greatly amplified by his capacity to jump off air, just like Maki and Toji. He can use his slashing attacks to guard against oncoming attacks. He is seemingly capable of attacking the soul directly and healing from attacks that target it, and certain forms of Sukuna that we've seen even wield a curse tool that can summon bolts of lightning. Now, all of these abilities are well and good and pretty fundamental to Sukuna's bag, but he has 3 main abilities in his arsenal that I would consider his most potent, most dangerous, and most effective. Those being the World Slash, Malevolent Shrine, and Furnace. The World Slash is simply his long-range slashing technique amplified by him chanting, signing, and aiming his attack in order to bypass the durability of his opponent. Its range and targeting is so precise that it was even able to get past Gojo's Infinity, one of the strongest defensive abilities I've ever witnessed in anime and manga. His domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine, allows him to swarm his enemies in an onslaught of unavoidable and lethal slashes that will continue until his enemy is either eviscerated or he ends the domain of his own volition. And once Dismantle and Cleave have stoked the fire of the furnace enough, Sukuna can bring out his fire arrow, which is essentially just a thermobaric bomb that will instantly hit his opponent and incinerate them without question. The fire arrow cannot be launched at will in the same way that the domain expansion, World Slash, and regular Dismantle and Cleave can, at least not with the full speed and range of it being available to him, and it requires many slashes to land on his opponent and a domain to be expanded in order to use it to its fullest extent. With all of these abilities and a reserve of curse energy leagues beyond Yuta's with a control over it rivaling Gojo's, it's no surprise why Sukuna is Jujutsu Kaisen's big bad and the king of curses within his own universe. But now it's time to see how that title holds up to a bit of outside scrutiny. Is Sukuna's diverse array of hacks enough to contend with Muzan? Is the King of Curses powerful enough to fight the Demon King? Well, right now is the time to answer that very question. Sukuna versus Muzan is an interesting and somewhat complex battle to discuss for a few reasons. For starters, the stat difference and how that plays into their dynamic in battle is something you have to constantly factor in when determining who wins this fight. Even when highballing Sukuna's speed and arguing that he's beyond a lightning timer, the degree to which he surpasses this speed doesn't compare to Muzan in the slightest. Not only is the lightning timer argument a highball in Sukuna's case, but even with that generosity being given, Demon Slayer characters are able to dodge lightning so much more casually that Muzan blitzing end of series Hashira means a lot more than Sukuna being faster than Akari and Kashimo. And when you look at the more reasonable and concrete Mach 25 to 50 scaling for Sukuna, this speed gap gets even worse. You could lowball Muzan as much as possible to get Sukuna and him to be much more comparable, but it's just not something that really makes sense in the grand scheme of things, and when looking at both of their most consistent speed showings, Muzan has a great advantage. Conversely, Muzan's attack potency, strength, and resilience just pale in comparison to Sukuna's. At his best, Muzan should be large town level, while city level Sukuna is an extremely reserved estimate for the character, with more appropriate and up-to-date arguments placing him all the way at island level, basically meaning that all of Sukuna's attacks will cut through Muzan like butter, and he'll have no trouble surviving the Demon King's abilities. On its own, this would make for a rather interesting battle that doesn't just come down to a glorified stat comparison, but Muzan's immunity to all attacks outside of direct sunlight means that while Sukuna can harm Muzan, killing him can only be accomplished by fighting until the sun is exposed, and Muzan is vulnerable to its effects. Now, there is technically another viable option for Sukuna depending on your interpretation of his abilities. However, the standard win con for both characters is as follows. Sukuna has to fight Muzan until the sun rises, and Muzan has to exhaust all of Sukuna's stamina, weakening him to the point to which he can actually do significant damage. A unique set of circumstances for both characters that really takes into account their tactics, previous experiences, and hacks. Muzan's healing factor that surpasses even the best in Jujutsu Kaisen, combined with his immortality during the night and unlimited stamina, would definitely push Sukuna in a unique way. However, Sukuna's invisible slashes, domain expansion, healing factor of his own, and large pool of energy would allow him to contend pretty well against Muzan, all things considered. So, with that being said, what's the outcome of this fight? Well, aside from actually setting the win cons, the first factor that is important to note in how this battle goes is stamina, namely Sukuna's. See, demons don't run out of energy, which means they can fight at their maximum ability forever, and this point has factored into many fights within Demon Slayer. We know that Sukuna doesn't literally have infinite stamina in the same way that Muzan does, based on his long gauntlet against the verse. which begs the obvious question of whether or not Sukuna would be able to fight against Muzan for an entire night straight without losing so much steam that Muzan's strength is enough to harm him. Well, based on the numerous statements and feats within the verse, I've determined that under the preset conditions, Sukuna should be able to maintain his curse energy levels and still have room to spare. This is because Sukuna has been stated, implied, and shown at numerous different points in the story to have cursed energy control rivaling Gojo's, a character who has been said to never run out of cursed energy under normal battle conditions. In chapter 233, Gojo himself says that Sukuna has to be relative to him in cursed energy manipulation in order to pull off the things he's doing in this fight. Couple that with them having equal domain refinement and Sukuna being able to open his domain countless times, even when functioning with only a portion of his normal energy, and there's absolutely no reason why Sukuna's stamina should be a problem in this fight. The comparison to Gojo is what really solidifies this as fact, because Gojo's stamina feats and statements are no joke. Gojo's refinement would allow him to power a country for an entire year. Yuta says that Gojo doesn't run out of cursed energy under normal circumstances. A weaker and less skilled Gojo was able to run his technique for 3 days straight, and in his prime, Gojo basically never turns off the Limitless. Sukuna's efficiency, even being remotely comparable to him, is enough to argue for his stamina, but he also has well over double the amount of cursed energy Satoru has. With it being clear that Sukuna has the endurance to participate in this fight for a while, the tactics of both fighters are now on the board, which is an entire discussion in itself. The speed advantage that Muzan possesses would basically negate most of Sukuna's attacks, especially all of his physical and visible ones. I could see Dismantle landing pretty regularly on Muzan considering he shouldn't be able to see them, but Muzan's healing factor is so advanced that the amount of damage he'd take in the long term is negligible, and once the surprise factor of invisible slices have worn off, Muzan is purely going to be on the offensive and just attack Sukuna with no real danger to himself until 2 key words are spoken: domain expansion. The one technique that Sukuna has at his disposal that eliminates any speed difference, the great equalizer in this fight, and one that makes the gap in strength between these two even larger. When using it in his default state, Muzan's skittish nature would make him prone to try to escape its range, which he could do with his superior speed and healing, but as shown in chapter 230, Sukuna can and is willing to close off his domain in order to seal away an opponent's option to run, something that Muzan would really have no counter for. It's possible that Sukuna would have to expend the cursed energy to use another domain expansion to figure this out, after having Muzan flee from the 200-meter range of his open barrier domain, but using the pinnacle of sorcery multiple times in one fight has never shown itself to be a problem for the King of Curses. After successfully trapping Muzan, Sukuna just has to keep his domain activated for the rest of the battle, as Muzan is torn apart and stitched back together over and over and over and over. And if Sukuna is feeling adventurous, I'm sure the slashes landing on Muzan in time would allow for him to launch the fire arrow and incinerate him, although I don't see that attack doing much more than extending the amount of time that it takes for Muzan to regenerate. Now, despite Sukuna being capable of fighting Muzan and keeping him at bay until the morning, it's pretty hard to say that he would come to the conclusion that the sun is the answer to defeating him without outside information. And if Sukuna does close off his barrier, then there's no way for the sunlight to directly hit Muzan. I could possibly see Muzan flexing and bragging after he realizes that Sukuna doesn't have a Nichiren blade, essentially proclaiming himself immortal unless the sun is present, but that's kind of up in the air and depends on how braggadocious you think Muzan is. If you think Sukuna is capable of figuring out that the sun is his weakness for whatever reason, or Muzan says this himself, then he wins pretty straight up. But if you think he's incapable, or Muzan himself wouldn't reveal this in his pompousness, then in all honesty, Sukuna simply doesn't have any conventional or straightforward means of defeating the Demon King. If we were talking about certain forms of Sukuna, namely Megana, then the use of Mahoraga would allow for him to adapt to Muzan's regenerative abilities and gain some new technique application that would make this effective. But that isn't the version of Sukuna being discussed today. If Sukuna continues to fight Muzan forever, eventually he'll get tired. Muzan won't, but he will, and this would result in an eventual Sukuna loss. In the scenario that Sukuna is incapable of inducing Muzan's weakness, the only remaining win con for Sukuna would be slashing Muzan's very soul, bypassing his conventional durability and healing factor, which we know he can do as he was able to harm Mahito very early on in the series. The fact he is capable of healing soul damage as well confirms spiritual awareness, further substantiating the potential for soul slashing attacks at his disposal. How in character it is for him to use it is ambiguous though, as it seems his normal slashes don't have soul damaging properties, as many characters are able to use RCT and recover from them. In Muzan's case, he really only has one win con against the King of Curses, and that's simply outlasting him. I talked about it briefly before, but regenerating endlessly shouldn't be a problem for Muzan, and despite Sukuna's likely near limitless reserves of energy due to his efficiency, we know that specific circumstances can cause his stamina to wane eventually. And the fact that he doesn't have literally infinite stamina means that no matter how long you think he can go, infinite is a lot more than almost infinite. If Muzan is able to shut down Sukuna's other win cons, keep his cards close to his chest, and make this purely a war of attrition, then, by all accounts, Muzan Kibitsuji would be the victor of this fight. Now, while I did say that Sukuna only has 2 win cons, one being related to the soul slashes and the other being related to using the sun, that actually isn't quite true even when ignoring Mahoraga and adaptation as an option, because he still does possess the ability to make binding vows, something that fans of the story have realized that he really enjoys doing. If pushed far enough in this fight, similarly to how he felt against Gojo, I could see Sukuna making a binding vow that has the ability to permanently damage or incapacitate Muzan by expanding or restricting the target of his technique, much like Yuji has done in chapter 263. Limiting the range of his slashes to exclusively Muzan's soul, or even improving its efficacy against healing type characters in general by adding another requirement to his slashes, is within the realm of possibility for the character. He'd simply have to be pushed far enough to do so. In all honesty though, while no individual win con is certain for Sukuna, I think that the multitude of ways that he can win and potentially sway the odds in his favor supersedes the one endurance-based win con that Muzan has in his favor. Sukuna versus Muzan would definitely be a high difficulty fight for either character due to their opponent's trickiness, endurance, and general unknown abilities, but it's one that I find the King of Curses coming out on top in more often than not. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more versus battle content like this, click here for more cross-verse battles and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.